Okay, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. Stephen E. Andrews here, and I find myself falling behind. I've been ahead for weeks, and I've just come to a day off in the midst of a intense week of summer book selling, which I won't go into. And I sort of realised that I'm sort of knee out of material. I've got lots of ideas which I'm trying to prepare to film, but I've not done any preparation. I haven't had the time recently. So this is kind of a gap filler, so my apologies. There will be some thematic and specific stuff to come over the next couple of weeks, as I've been saying on the community page. And I thought really what we'd do today was have a look at maybe you could call it a book haul, but it's really just some stuff which I've acquired and read recently, or read recently. So I just thought I'd take you through some of it. And you know, typically there's a lot of noise around at the moment. The kids are playing in the street outside. Go back to school. You know, I bet there's lots of parents thinking that. And I just have to shut the windows. It's boiling hot. The video we do is put the washing on, so because the boiler is going thunk in the background every 5 minutes. So I do apologise. So this is kind of thrown together, but you know, we will get there with the quality of the books themselves. So let's see what I'm reading, what I've been reading, what I've acquired recently that I've sort of missed out. And I do need to do some more eBaying actually to facilitate purchases. And of course, do remember I do get a discount. So, you know, it's not a case like people go out and do these huge book hauls, which everybody likes to see on YouTube. And, you know, you burn out because they run out of money. It's just ridiculous. So what am I reading at the moment? At the moment, I am reading Polyphemus by Michael Shear, or Michael Shea. I call him Michael Shear because there were two writers called Michael Shear, maybe three, so you've got to be careful. This is the guy he died a few years ago, very acclaimed writer of science fiction, fantasy and horror, and his fantasy and SF always has a very sort of horror tinge. Now, as I've said before, horror isn't a genre, it's an approach. So you could overall say that this is a horror volume. There are 7 stories in here, a short story collection. It's Grafton from the late 80s, marvellous. It's got this very sort of Lovecraftian type cover, which I know a lot of you will like. And Shear has written quite a few Lovecraftian stories. There is a book of them called The Demiurge, which I currently have on order. And I'm going to do a feature about Shear soon because he's good and sort of quite neglected. You know, he's one of those writers who never had a bestseller. Within the sort of cognoscenti in the field, you know, he was very, very highly thought of, won lots of awards, and other writers, so he was fantastic, and he is very good. So I'm reading this currently, and it has 7 stories, which I find is an almost ideal number for longer stories. One of my favourite short story collections, the Alfred Bester's The Dark Side of the Earth. There is a video about that just on this channel. I know everybody reads Tiger, or The Star's My Destination, as you call it in the USA, or as you call it if you're around, you know, if you didn't buy till after 1985, and The Demolished Man. But the short stories are great as well. There are 7 of those. There are 7 of these as well. And the title story is a science fiction story, very, very well written. And I'm just finishing the final story in this at the moment. And there's a award-winning fantasy story in here from the Niftaleen sequence called Pearls of the Vampire Queen. There's a couple of very bizarre horror stories in here. Very, very good. He wrote really well. He was very big on using words like motile. You know, and you could see the influences of people like Vance and Lovecraft. I will be talking about Shear in reference to both of those when I do the video about him, which will probably be a couple of weeks' time. But I'm enjoying that at the moment. I don't think he's quite as good as everybody says he is, but he's a very interesting figure. So one to look out for, quite uncommon. You don't see it very much. I think the hardcover first was Arkham House. It doesn't give much of a printing history in here, but it does. Algis Budris, who provides the introduction, does say that it's Arkham House, so there you go, because those things don't usually get edited out, they just reprint them, so it is what it is. So I'm reading that at the moment. Recently reread Brian Aldiss' Report on Probability A, very fine new wave science fiction novel from the late 60s, and this very much reminds me of the Nouveau Roman, the new novel of the early 60s, people like Alain Robbe-Grillet. There's lots of very detailed, repetitive descriptions, but it is an SF novel. It's really good. It's quite hard going, even though it's thin, because it is very repetitive and quite stark. And it's just about people in alternate worlds who are watching each other. And it's like sort of a pile of reflecting mirrors as somebody's watching somebody and somebody else is watching them and what have you. But it really focuses around some activities of a few people in what seems to be an English village, and really, really good. So enjoyed that. That was great. Also, recently I read this book, Gathering Evidence by Martin McInnes. Now, there we go, quite handsome looking as you see, and it's from Atlantic Books, who do some interesting stuff. And I have to say, it took me ages to finish this, and I was reading it in work, and it's quite grim. And he's regarded as, the Times says, the best experimentalist now at work. And I think he won the Goldsmiths Prize, which M. John Harrison won recently. And, it's about a group of women scientists that go into a jungle to look at the last surviving bonobos, which of course are a species or subspecies, I think, really, of chimpanzees, the most intelligent ones. And something seems to be stalking them, or maybe it isn't, maybe it's metaphoric. There's more to it than that. Is it a science fiction novel? It's on the borderline. I didn't feel it quite came off. It's a very dour book. It begins really, really well with this fantastic description of an app which comes into sort of play, and people have this app, and it's called Nest, and it has a huge impact on human consciousness, and it's really, really good. It doesn't really go back to that except in kind of a metaphoric way. So I did find it very grim and dull, and I have to say it didn't deliver the kind of quantum punch I wanted. If you wanted to read a book which does that, read Remainder by Tom McCarthy, which I think is one of the finest metaphysical thrillers and SF novels of recent years. So that I was disappointed by. At the same time, or rather just after Gathering Evidence, I read a book called The People in the Trees by Yana Gahara, who is a contemporary novelist who had a massive smash hit a few years ago with a book called A Little Life, and a new book's just come out as well. And People in the Trees looks like this. And again, it's a jungle-based narrative, very similar to Gathering Evidence, about a doctor who's rather recalcitrant. He's young and he's only just qualified, and he sort of seems out of sorts with life, and he goes to this Pacific island with a sociologist and a linguist, I think it is, sort of Levi Strauss type figure, anthropologist I should say, and they go to see this tribe who reportedly have elders who are immortal because they've ingested some substance from a turtle. And it's a very grim, dour book, and I found it too tedious. I think the problem is that it was too similar to this, and it was a bit too much of the same thing for me. And I have to say it was a DNF for me. I've never said that before. A did not finish. So I put it down. If I'm not enjoying the book and I don't think it's getting there for me, I put it down, and I usually don't go back to it because life is too short. So that was The People in the Trees. And it was one of those things where the science really bugged me, because it was describing the jungles in this South Pacific milieu, and they refer to monkeys and things, and there aren't. If you go to the middle of the Pacific, it was describing the sort of fauna that doesn't exist in that milieu. But it was a science fiction novel, so there is that sort of thing going on. But I personally didn't enjoy it. Something I enjoyed a lot more, which is a science fiction novel. According to some bibliographic databases, it's a crime novel, and it isn't. Except that Penguin have done a dreadful job of jacketing it and making it look like a crime novel, is The Anomaly. This is The Anomaly by Herve de Thiel, and this won the Prix Goncourt Prize in 2020. The Prix Goncourt is France's preeminent literary prize, named after the Goncourt brothers, famous sort of literary brothers from sort of late 19th century. And anything that wants a Prix Goncourt is worth looking at. And so they've done this rather generic cover, and this crept out in hardcover, I think earlier this year, and I did look at it, and I picked it up while I was working. I was guesting in a bookshop in Chippenham, and they had a copy there. It was a third printing. I tend to only buy hardcovers if they're first. And I started reading, I thought, yeah, this is for me. And the basic idea of The Anomaly, I'm going to talk you through it. I'm going to move this primo lever a minute, because you've been gazing on that. I'll talk about that in a sec as well. And the basic idea of The Anomaly is it's sort of set contemporaneously. And there's a jumbo jet flying from France to the USA, and it goes through a storm, and it lands in the USA. I think it lands in New York at JFK, I think. And when it lands, everything's fine. And then 3 months later, the same plane lands again with the same people on board. Somehow they've been duplicated in the course of this storm but the duplicates haven't arrived for 3 months. Nobody's aware of this. And it's a sort of conceit that Christopher Priest does really well. Now that sort of comes up in the middle of the book. What you get early on is you get introduced to some of the characters who become duplicated. And I thought this would be done in rather a sort of prosaic way, but it's done in a very exciting way with the first character we come across who is depicted very well, who's basically a hitman. It's not sort of depicted in a thriller-esque way, but it's in a very sort of cool, detached way. And the great thing about this book, you get the feeling the translation is really good. I've not read it in French, as I can't read French. I haven't got schoolboy French. And the thing that struck me was that it felt French, but at the same time, the translation was so good that you could tell where the translator had thought about the need to have Americanisms, and probably they're there in the original writing of Herve de Tellier. And it's just really good, and it has a fantastic ending, which I don't want to talk to you about. The ending did remind me of the last moments of the ending of The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. It does that sort of conceptual breakthrough. Now, Herve de Tellier, I've just realised I've said de Tellier, it's de Tellier. He is a member of a literary group called Oulipo. Now, if you've never heard of Oulipo, they're a very strange cadre of artists, and the most famous one was a guy called Georges Perec, who had a bestseller back in late 80s, early 90s with a book called Life, a User's Manual. And Perec's that was his most famous book. A lot of people bought it, hardly anybody understood it. I have read one book by him, which is a book called A Void. Not a void, but A Void, as opposed to The Void. And that was fascinating because he wrote it in French without using the letter E. It was then translated into English by a brilliant translator whose name escapes me, also without using the letter E. Now, you know, there's only 5 vowels in the English language, and it's just incredible. So when you read it, it's a very disorienting experience. It's very interesting. So if you're up for a bit of experimental writing, do sort of try A Void by Perec. And as I say, de Tellier is a member, Le Tellier, I shall get it right in a minute, is a member of the Oulipo group, which is quite loose, I think. And he's done about 15 or 16 novels. And it's also a metafiction. It's a book. It's a science fiction novel. It's also a metafiction, which means fiction about fiction. So it sort of comments on itself, and there's an author character who seems to be maybe a link to Le Tellier and his career. There's certain echoes and what have you. And I just thought it was fantastic, really good book. And probably the best SF novel I've read for months. And it's, you know, it's not conventional, but that's why I liked it. You know, it's really got a great idea at its heart. The writing's great, the characters are really good, you really sort of care about what happens to them even when they're unpleasant and sympathetic, and it's great stuff. So I really recommend The Anomaly. You probably won't find it in any SF sections. Do buy it, really, really good. I'm certainly going to look for more books by him and see what else is out there and try some more of his work. So that's one that will suit people who like modernism, contemporary literary fiction and SF. Really, really good. So that's The Anomaly, give it a try. I've recently read one half of this. This is an omnibus of 2 novels by Barry N. Malzberg. Barry N. Malzberg is one of the finest science fiction writers in America. His career as an SF writer began really about 1968 and was pretty much over by about 82. He's done a couple of things since then. He worked for a literary agency a lot. And rather like Rob Silverberg, he is very sort of urbane, sophisticated, clever guy. He did lots of hack work. He wrote lots of sort of like some softcore novels and crime novels and what have you, and he wrote some just stunning SF, and I'm going to do at least 2 videos about Barry's work upcoming. I just haven't got around to it yet. And Stark House, this is Stark House, they're this wonderful sort of publisher. They do a lot of print on demand and they're trade paperback, so apparently they do a little series which are A formats according to Jules Birch, so I must take a look at those. And that's the format these are, and they're basically reissues. They're reissues of books from the 60s, 70s, which are very obscure, had one printing, they're often pseudonymous, and these are 2 books by Barry Malzberg, to which I wasn't aware of. And Fire, which is the one I've read out of this omnibus, is about a Vietnam vet who comes back from Vietnam, and he's got PTSD, and of course they didn't sort of call it that then. If they called it anything, it was combat fatigue or shell shock, and he is struck impotent and he is desperate for sexual congress, as you probably would be after being shot up by the VC for months on end, and he's quite young, and so it does have a sort of soft core element of it, sort of an adult book element, and it was entitled something else. but it's not one of his best books, but I did enjoy it. It's very, very good. And there's this additional material here by Miles Burke, and he tells you about, you know, how he feels he sort of nailed things before, and how if this had got to a bigger publisher than the sort of pulpy house which issued it, that it could have won the National Book Award. I wouldn't go that far, but I think, you know, if a literary editor got hold of it, they said, you know, can you rewrite? You would have something quite special here. But great stuff. So it's great to read a book by Barry I hadn't read, because I've read loads in many, many years, and it's only the very obscure non-SF ones, the ones I haven't got now. And behind me here, you'll see an array of his books in Stark House. There are 3 I haven't got from Stark. There are more coming. I'll show you a picture of them right now. And as I say, I've got a couple more on order, and there will be more of this series, the Mike Barry Lone Wolf series, coming, and I'm going to talk about them in another video. So I picked some of these up recently. Some of them I already had in the original A formats from houses like Olympia Press, but it's really nice to see these in print. But you won't find them in a bookshop. You pretty much have to order them online specially. So that sort of is a bit of variety. What else has been happening? Well, something I've never read. I always meant to sort of get around to it because it's French, it's a science fiction novel, it's also a children's book, and I've sold, you know, probably 1,000 in my time as a bookseller, loads and loads, because it's a sort of kind of a modern classic. Is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Now, I'm not going to try and pronounce these things correctly because I have no idea what it should be, but this is the Puffin cloth bound children's science fiction novel. As you see, it's very, very beautiful, and you know, this is absolutely lovely. And de Saint-Exupéry was basically a pilot, and he wrote some great, very lyrical books about flying sort of mail planes and what have you in the 1940s and before that. And I've read a couple of those a long time ago, but this is his most famous book. People generally don't know his other work. It is in Penguin Modern Classics, his other work. Wind, Sand and Stars, things like that. Some of them used to be picadors, and they're really, really good if you like aviation. And this I've never got around to reading, so this is going to be great fun, and obviously that's going to be a quick read. So I've got that recently. Very, very nice indeed. And these Puffin cloth bounds are really nice. They're nicer than the adult ones, I think. The adult ones tend not to have too much pictorial design on the cover, and I do think they're rather overrated, and these are really nice, so I like that. So that's a good one. What else? Well, because I've had a bit of a mainstream thing recently, I picked up a couple of books which I've been meaning to read for like decades and never got round to, and I recently acquired this. I've looked at this book so many times secondhand, and I've never got around to actually buying it, and it's not that uncommon. And this is A Maggot by John Fowles, which tends to baffle people. It's published by Jonathan Cape, who I'm always talking about. Jonathan Cape, I love Cape books, and it dates back to the 80s, and I remember when this came out, 85, so I just pretty much just started bookselling. I'd been in bookselling about a year when this came out, and it looks like an historical novel. It's actually a science fiction novel. I've read a lot about it. I've never read it. Fowles had quite a big impact on me when I read The Magus, which I think is a fantastic book. It also had a massive impact on Christopher Priest and really helped him sort of mesh traditional SF with some of Fowles's approaches, which sort of made him into the writer he became, you know, and obviously his own personality and genius as well. But that was a big thing for Chris. So I'm looking forward to this because I've not actually ever read it, and I do need to get it under my belt, really. So that's one to come up. So, Primo Levi, which I keep presenting to the front there, and this is The Sixth Day, published by Michael Joseph around about 1990, and I acquired this second-hand recently because I think it's out of print at the moment. And Primo Levi, it was a Italian Jewish writer who was one of the victims of the Holocaust, but he survived, and he wrote a book about it called If This Is a Man, and there's another one called The Truce, and he was basically a chemist, and his work sort of had a big revival in Britain in the mid-80s when Abacus published it, and they published this book, The Periodic Table. This is the current Penguin Modern Classic. I had to buy this because my other one had gone the way of all flesh, and this is sort of like a book of reminiscences of people he knew and stories he wanted to tell from his life, and comparing them to the chemical elements, the table of chemical elements. Lots of people have taken this template and done other things since, non-fiction things, fiction things, but I think he was the first, and this was a smash at the time. It's a great book, and I really recommend that. And the Holocaust obviously had a big impact on him, so much so that even though he survived, he committed suicide by throwing himself down a flight of stairs, which is just, you know, shocking, really. It's rather like Rothko in a way. And, you know, it's 1987, and it was just after his success in the UK. And, you know, it really sort of troubled him, obviously. But do you think to survive that and then to commit suicide, it kind of tells you quite a lot, doesn't it? So that's it. So I got this because this is his science fiction stories. And apparently he wrote these because he'd read some SF and he'd found it very inspiring, and he decided to write a collection of science fiction stories. And I'd probably seen this book, but I hadn't really sort of paid a lot of attention because I read Levi back in the 80s, as I say. So I missed this one, really. And Levi was published by the great Italian publishing house Ackroyd, who is still extant and one of the key Italian publishing houses. They've done some great work over the years. And his editor there was Italo Calvino. Now, if you don't know who Calvino is, I'll talk about him in a moment. And so he sort of worked with Levi, and he came up with this, and I'm really looking forward to reading this because I am a fan of Italian writing. I do love going on holiday in Italy, so I'm really looking forward to it because I think it's going to be very special. As you can see, I've got the old H.G. Wells Invisible Man mug out there with a chip in it, but that was all that was available. Lots of washing up to do in the kitchen, I'm afraid. So yeah, speaking about Levi, Calvino, Italo Calvino, this is the complete Cosmic Comics, which I picked up secondhand recently. I should have bought this new, but it got went out of print very quickly. And there are 2 books in here. Now, Calvino was one of Italy's sort of premier modernists. And in the sort of canon of Italian fiction, he occupies the same sort of position that, say, Georges Louis Borges does in Latin America. And he's kind of a sort of postmodern fabulist, sort of teller of tales, writer of metafictions, fiction about fiction. There's one book which is about characters telling tales through tarot cards. And there's a certain similarity to the sort of tarot card thing which you get in Roger Zelazny's Amber. And I say there's 2 of these. The first one's called Cosmic Comics. It's going to be reissued in Penguin cloth bound in about 4 days. So by the time you see this, it'll probably be out. And it looks like this. This also includes the short story collection, which I think in Italian is called T minus or something like that, and it's something to do with taking a mathematical formula and writing stories based on it. But in the UK it was called Time and the Hunter, which is one of my favourite titles of all time. I don't know why, it just really grabs me. And I read Time of the Hunter back in the 80s when it was an Abacus paperback, and I got rid of it in a cull, and you know, I should have kept it because it's like hen's teeth now, and I really liked it with the particular cover it has. And just to tell you about these, and basically there's an introduction in here, and this is, let's see, it's by somebody called William Weaver, and Tim Parks, a great English writer who writes on Italian matters, also contributed to this. And William Weaver says that, you know, these aren't science fiction stories. Calvino was very sort of keen to say they're not science fiction stories, that he'd invented a new genre of stories based on science. It's like, and you get some of these sort of super literary guys who, you know, won't go near genre fiction in case it infects their canon, who don't understand what science fiction is. They are science fiction stories. It's that simple. I haven't read the novel, but I have read the short stories in Time and the Hunter, which is the 2nd volume, and they are very much SF. The basic idea of these is they are narrated by a being. The name is unpronounceable, but it's spelled QFWFQ. I'll try and put that on the screen. Kuf or something like that. It's just unpronounceable. It's deliberately unpronounceable to suggest a cosmic being. And this being is the age of the universe. He's always been there. He has relatives. And he occupies different bodies of different things throughout time. And some of them are inanimate things and some of them are animate things like birds. At one point he becomes a dinosaur. And it's just sort of these little vignettes through time. And they are quite playful. There is some science stuff in them. They're very, very hard to describe, and they are very fabulous. They're sort of, you know, quite bizarre, and I've not read them for years, so I'm looking forward to reading Cosmic Comics in whole and the short stories again. And I'll just read what Gore Vidal said in the New York Review of Books. And what Gore said was this: entirely unlike anything that anyone else has written, except Gore Vidal probably never read Olaf Stapleton, for example. In Cosmic Comics, Calvino makes it possible for the reader to inhabit a meson, a mollusk, a dinosaur, makes him for the first time see light ending a dark universe. Well, you know, we've already done that in SF. Obviously, Stapleton is the obvious, but there's other things as well. And, you know, it says here, before the universe began to expand, when all of everything existed in a single point in space, you know, the Big Bang, the singularity, he was there, and afterwards, throughout the millennia, across galaxies in different shifting forms, he persisted, and he has some stories to tell. So it's kind of cosmic SF there, very playful and metafictional kind. So yeah, so Levi and Calvino. So when I've read both of those, I might do a thing about Italian SF, because there isn't much of it. And in Italian, they don't really have a term for science fiction. I think they have fantastico or fantastica, which means fantasy, and usually gets lumped in. So that's an interesting thing. So we'll come on to that. And I'm always looking out for Italian SF because it's really hard to come by. Something I picked up, this has got quite an internationalist flavour, this, isn't it? I like that. Is because I read a Peter Tate novel recently, Country Love and Poison Rain, and apparently I was talking to an academic yesterday from the University of Bath who used to be a customer of mine when I ran a bookshop there. And he came in to see me, and he said that he was asking whether I could participate in a podcast, which was for a student, I think, who was either at the LSE or he's an international relations student or something. He does a podcast, and they're interested in the relationship between international relations and the possibilities of politics in science fiction. And he said they want me to do a podcast on the subject of biological and chemical warfare in SF, so that'll be interesting. So Peter Tate came to mind immediately. But we're talking about Welsh SF, and I decided at some point I'm going to do a Welsh SF roundup, and that made me think of a writer who I haven't read for years, which is David Redd. And David Redd, here we are, this is a nice laminated boards edition which he self-published. I don't normally go for self-published books, but in this case he was professionally published. He only ever wrote short stories. He did it in his spare time. There's never been a collection. This is his sort of collected works, and I quite like this. It's got a very old school feeling in it, and sort of probably his most famous story is a story called On the Deck of the Flying Bomb, which I think was in New Worlds in the 60s, and I probably read about 6 stories by him, so I'm looking forward to delving into this. So that's a bit of Welsh skiffy for you, and there will be a Welsh skiffy roundup at some point where I cover more of Peter Tate's work, some of Krista Evans's work, a few other writers that which I'm looking at the moment as well. So that'll come when I've done some more reading. I think I mentioned a while ago that I read a book called Circus of Dreams by John Walsh. This was about a month and a half ago, and here it is. And Circus of Dreams, Adventures in the 1980s Literary World. And John Walsh started his career after he left university working for Gollancz, and this is in the late 70s, and it begins with his anecdotes. You know, he sort of fell in love with British literary fiction in the 70s when he was a young undergraduate, and then he went to work for Gollancz, and he describes working for them at the end of the 70s, and he went on, became a publicist, journalist, and he worked in the book trade a lot. And this is like a nostalgic look back at the wonderful state of British publishing in the 1980s, which was fantastic. It was fantastic in the mainstream and fantastic in genre fiction as well. And it was really exciting because it took me back to the days when I began in the book trade, when we were first starting to get large bookshops throughout the country, courtesy of Waterstones and Dillons, and it was coming out of the back street, and there seemed to be exciting new authors, people like Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, Peter Ackroyd, Angela Carter. These people all come up, and they really, Ian McEwan, they all exploded in the 80s. Some of them were better than others, some of them weathered time better than others, but this is a really exciting read, and there's a lot in here about book selling as well, and I really loved it. And I say, if you're interested in the history of publishing and book selling in the UK, particularly in the 1980s, which is a real revolutionary time. It created the book selling world we have today, you know, for good or ill. It has changed since then, as this is very keen to point out. This is a fantastic book, and funnily enough, you know, as I say, having read this, and recently we've had the thing with Rushdie in New York, which is appalling and really is shocking, and it's a sort of thing that should never happen. I personally, when I managed a bookshop on a campus, was once approached by certain men of a certain character asking why I was stocking the Satanic Verses, and my response was simple: there's nothing illegal about it. It's legal for people to be published and read in this country, and it's freedom of choice. And they sort of muttered off really and walked off muttering. But you know, that's the thing, you've got to stand up to these people. A lot of people did do that, translators, publishers, what have you, and you know, and the repercussions are there. So it's very important that we sort of support freedom of choice and expression, you know. So I hope Salman gets well soon, and what a terrible thing to happen. You know, the security really was lax, wasn't it? So anyway, with the John Walsh book in mind, that got me thinking the 80s, and I picked up some Martin Amis and picked up some other things and read through them. And it reminded me really that for me, apart from the people I really liked, like Ballard, Priest, Carter, what have you, the person I liked the most from that period was Peter Ackroyd. So I reread Hawksmoor, his third novel, wonderful bestseller. Because Peter Ackroyd these days, he does a lot of history and biography. He doesn't write fiction so much. He wrote Danleymo and the Limehouse Golem, which was made into a film a few years ago. Not read that one, but really sort of erudite guy, you know. And this is a fantastic book. And if you don't know the story about this, basically Ian Sinclair wrote a book called Lead Heat, which is like a prose poem and notebook about how certain churches in London were designed by a chap called Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was one of Wren's apprentices, Christopher Wren's apprentices, and they've got a certain character about them, and they were supposedly, according to Sinclair, built on like ley lines, and they have occult symbolism and what have you in them. And this is a novel about that, partially narrated by Hawksmoor in sort of fairly old English, which is quite challenging, but it's really, really good to read. And there's a contemporary narrative with a detective called Hawksmoor, was investigating a string of serial killings which are rather inexplicable, and the two things mesh together. So it is kind of a horror novel, an occult thriller, but it's a very subtle one. And the word esoteric, the word hermetic, the word arcane comes to mind when I think about this. And it doesn't play his hand too much. It's quite subtle, but it really is quite brilliant. This is a first edition, very beautiful. I've had this a long time, and I really, really enjoyed it. What I decided to do then was to read a book by Ackroyd, which I hadn't read before. This one, First Light, that came out, I think, the very end of the 80s. Let's have a look. This is a first. You can get this very, very cheap, 89. And I didn't get into this at the time. I looked at it. And it's got a very beautiful cover, as you see, very English. And it's one of those things where I've been to Lyme Regis recently, as you would have seen in one of the videos. And a while ago I went to West Kennet Longbarrow, which isn't far from me. I'm very struck by it and the beauty of the English countryside in the southwest. And this is set near Lyme Regis, some of it is set in Lyme Regis, and it's about a structure, I'd call it a long barrow, it's not referred to as that. There's like a tomb structure which has been revealed by a forest fire. There's been a forest fire and some of the trees have gone, and they've noticed that there's this sort of temp, as it were, and some archaeologists go to investigate this and to see what's in this tomb. And there's a strange cast of characters. There's meditations at the beginning and the end from astronomers. There's an observatory nearby, and there are astronomers who are looking at the light from Aldebaran and what have you. And it's this whole idea that light takes a long time from the birth of the universe, you know, if we're in the light cone, to come across the universe for us to see it. So when you see stars, you're looking back into distant abysses of time and what have you. And that's sort of hinted in here. But it's a very strange book indeed. And did I enjoy it? I enjoyed parts of it enormously. Some of it, though, is absurd. The characters are like, they're like cartoon characters, the sort of little characters you can say, like a Raymond Briggs thing, and they're not quite realistic. And there's a retired TV comic who is adopted, who believes that his family comes from this neck of the woods in Dorset near Lyme. There's a strange lesbian woman in it who is sort of in charge of the publicity for the archaeological dig. The archaeologists have different characters. One of them lives in Lyme, his wife has a disability, and he lives above an antique shop. And it's really quite hard to say what Ackroyd was trying to say with this. And you know, in some quarters it is described as an SF novel, and there are hints of that. And there's a family who live out in the countryside in this, a farming family called the Mints, M-I-N-T-S, and there's a father and the son, and the son is like an idiot savant, except only his father thinks he's a savant. And you know, there is a connection between them and the barrow. So there's also a kind of Robert Holdstock thing to it. So if you imagine a Robert Holdstock thing written through, you know, a very sort of fruity way of approaching characters, it's almost like self-parody. I'm not quite sure what Peterson was saying that. So it wasn't entirely successful, but it was interesting. It was irritating at times, but it was one of those books which, like Hawksmoor, left a lot of the mystery standing, and that's a good thing in a way, because you know, there's a lot of mysteries in life are never resolved, and mystery in itself can be a beautiful thing. So that was quite interesting. But what will be my next Ackroyd? It's hard to say really. I might leave it for a while because it was a sort of on-off thing. So that's a roundup of what I've been buying, reading, and I'm about to read. and we'll get back to some more thematic stuff soon. I hope you enjoyed that. Oh, there's one more to finish on an international flavour. I meant to show this last time I did a roundup. This is Yukio Mishima's Beautiful Star, issued here in Penguin Modern Classic, a paperback in wraps. They're not French flaps, they're wraps. It's a paperback in wraps, it's a trade paperback, and I do believe this is a UK first edition. Now, recently, Penguin Modern Classics have done a few Mishimas the last few years, ones which I hadn't come across before, which I've been waiting for them to be translated. Beautiful Star, apparently, according to this, though I don't recall this from reading his biography, but it was a long time ago I read that, Mishima thought this was his key book, and it's supposedly a science fiction novel, though I think it's very, very metaphoric. And it's about a family who it was published in 1962, so it's about family, love, nuclear war and UFOs, and he supposedly said it was his masterpiece. And it's about a family who discover, as they get to know each other better, that each of them is from a different planet. You know, the father's from Mars, another one is from Venus, and so on and that. But it's obviously meant in a very metaphoric way, so it's only kind of a science fiction novel by default. But I do love Mishima. I've got 3 now I haven't read because of these reissues. I probably don't like him as much now as I did when I was younger, but you know, when the mood descends upon me, I will be going back to such an extreme character, an interesting character. So Beautiful Star, again, when you go into a bookshop, you won't see it in an SF section, and give it some time. And this is sort of like the equivalent of the hardcover. In about a year's time, they'll do it in a standard B format. It'll look like a regular Penguin Modern Classic, so that's out there as well. So we've covered Italy, Wales, France, Japan, the UK. Good grief, we're getting around the world here. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing off for now with The Invisible Man, and I'll see you again soon. Do subscribe, all that stuff. Bye for now.